The Victorian era is packed with some of the best BBC period dramas out there. They've got all the social commentary, the drama, the atmosphere. Now, obviously, there are a ton of Victorian adaptations out there, but I've picked 10 miniseries based on classic novels that really capture the vibe of the era. Bleak House is a masterpiece of Victorian drama. The whole thing revolves around this never-ending legal case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and it shows how it destroys the lives of everyone caught up in it. It's a brutal takedown of the 19th century legal system, and it hits hard. The BBC's 2005 version nails the atmosphere, dark, suspenseful, and honestly kind of perfect for a cold, rainy night. Gillian Anderson is amazing. Carey Mulligan pops up in one of her early roles, and Charles Dance is unforgettable as Josiah Tulkinghorn, a villain so vile even Dance himself called him one of Dickens's worst. And that's saying something, considering how many despicable characters Dickens created. Dance is so good at being despicable that it got him cast as Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones. Little Dorrit is one of the BBC's finest Dickens adaptations, and it tells the story of Amy Dorrit, a girl who spent her entire life in Marshalsea prison for debt. She works as a seamstress for Mrs. Clenham, who's as cold and bitter as they come, but when Mrs. Clenham's son Arthur comes back to England, Amy's world completely changes. Claire Foy is amazing as Amy. Dickens's heroines are usually a little too perfect to be likable. Always tiny, blushing, and way too good. But Foy somehow makes Amy relatable and warm while still sticking to the character. Matthew Macfadyen plays Arthur, and he's great in it too. The music might sound familiar too. It's by John Lunn, who went on to compose the score for Downton Abbey. And if you're a fan of period dramas, you might recognize some of the costumes. They were borrowed from iconic 90s productions like Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma. The Barchester Chronicles is a BBC adaptation of the first two novels in Anthony Trollope's series, The Warden and Barchester Towers. It's all about church politics, where social reformers take aim at the Church of England for enriching itself at the expense of the poor. But don't let the heavy subject matter fool you. It's full of drama, romance, and some surprisingly sharp humor. The cast is incredible. Alan Rickman steals the show as Obadiah Slope, the slimy, self-serving chaplain in what was his breakthrough role. If you've only seen him as Colonel Brandon in Sense and Sensibility, where he's all compassion and charm, this is the complete opposite. Rickman's Slope is self-centered, manipulative, and absolutely unforgettable. The entire cast is spot on. If you read the books after watching, it's impossible to imagine the characters any other way. This miniseries won a BAFTA and is still one of the best Trollope adaptations out there. Cranford is all about the quirky, lovable residents of a small rural town trying to hold on to their traditions while the modern world closes in. The new railway system, cutting-edge medical techniques, it's all a bit much for the gentle, old-fashioned Cranford. The cast is stacked with legendary English actors, Judi Dench, Imelda Staunton, Eileen Atkins, and Deborah Findlay. Judi Dench, who read Cranford in school, said this adaptation reminded her of just how brilliant Elizabeth Gaskell's writing is, and hoped it would inspire people to read her work. What's interesting is that the show wasn't just based on Cranford. The creator, Sue Birtwistle, thought the novel alone wasn't enough for a series, so she combined 3 of Gaskell's novellas into one drama. Dench called the writing inspired and extraordinary, and honestly, she's not wrong. When North and South aired in November 2004, the BBC's website crashed hours later because so many people tried to log on. Most of the hype came down to Richard Armitage. He played John Thornton, and people were comparing him to Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. That's the kind of reaction he got. Armitage was actually the first actor to audition for Thornton, but it took weeks of auditions before the casting team circled back and realized he was the perfect choice. The story's about Margaret Hale, a young woman from southern England who moves to an industrial town in the north. She ends up clashing with Thornton, this strict mill owner, over his harsh labor practices, while also feeling drawn to him. It's tense, emotional, and somehow romantic all at the same time. Richard Armitage and Daniela Denby-Ashe as Margaret are perfect together. They make the whole thing work. Adapting David Copperfield isn't easy. The story's full of Dickens' usual sentimentality, and David himself can come off as too perfect to be interesting. But this version makes it work. Radcliffe is great here, better honestly than some of his early Harry Potter performances. He plays young David, this sweet, unlucky orphan who gets treated horribly by his stepfather and then shipped off to a cruel boarding school. But even with all the bad stuff he goes through, David stays kind, humble, and gets by with the help of some good friends. Chris Columbus used a clip of Radcliffe from this to show exactly what kind of kid he wanted to play Harry Potter. This miniseries is stacked with British talent, 6 Harry Potter actors included. Imelda Staunton, Zoe Wanamaker, Ian McKellen, Bob Hoskins, Dawn French, and Harry Lloyd, who just so happens to be Charles Dickens' great-great-great-grandson. Daniel Deronda is a solid BBC adaptation, even if it's not perfect. Hugh Dancy plays Daniel, this selfless and intelligent guy with mysterious origins, and Romola Garai is Gwendolyn Harleth, a woman who's so desperate to marry rich that she's willing to ruin her own happiness. Their lives overlap in a story that dives into gender, class, and anti-Semitism in Victorian England. Andrew Davies does a solid job with the adaptation, even if it doesn't quite capture the full power of George Eliot's prose. The show does handle the Jewish themes well, but some of it feels like it's just ticking boxes. Still, if you're into Victorian dramas, Daniel Deronda is worth watching, flaws and all. Wives and Daughters is one of those stories that stays with you. It's about Molly Gibson, whose life takes a turn when her widowed father decides to remarry. She ends up with a vain, status-obsessed stepmother and a lively stepsister who, to make things worse, becomes her rival in love. This mini-series feels like peak BBC period drama. You've got stunning countryside backdrops, incredible costumes. Apparently they made over 1,000 of them, and every little detail just pulls you in. The story's got all the classic period drama stuff. Love, family drama, society's expectations. But what makes it so great is how real the characters feel. They're flawed, proud, sometimes a little petty, but you end up loving them anyway. The BBC's 2006 version of Jane Eyre is one of the best takes on Charlotte Bronte's novel. Ruth Wilson plays Jane, and Toby Stephens is Mr. Rochester, who's exactly as brooding and mysterious as you'd hope. Jane's story is rough. She grows up as an orphan, stuck in a brutal charity school, and eventually becomes a governess at Thornfield Hall. That's where she meets Rochester, and things get complicated. There's something strange going on at Thornfield. Those weird noises at night aren't just for atmosphere. And when the truth comes out, it turns Jane's whole world upside down. The whole thing leans into the gothic vibe, making it perfect for a cozy night in. BBC's first ever adaptation of Hardy's novel isn't an easy story to sit through. Tess Durbeyfield starts out as this spirited, innocent young woman, but her life takes a dark turn after she's preyed on by her manipulative cousin, Alec. The consequences are heartbreaking, and things only get worse from there. The BBC's 2008 miniseries doesn't pull any punches, and Gemma Arterton is incredible as Tess. She brings so much depth and emotion to the role that it's impossible to look away, even when the story gets hard to watch. It's brutal, but it's also an eye-opening look at what women in late Victorian England were up against. If you can handle the heaviness, this adaptation is absolutely worth checking out. Gemma Arterton alone makes it unforgettable.